Just a graze, my heel against his shin under the polished mahogany, a total accident. That's the story I spun for myself anyway, initially. But then, the unmistakable pressure back, his knee a furnace against mine, and every nerve in my body went rigid. He didn't flinch away, neither did I. In that heartbeat of a moment, a silent current crackled between us, something raw and undeniable that I knew, bone deep, I could never unsee. I should have broken it, that connection, I know that now with the clarity of hindsight. But frozen there, across the table from Michael, my stepson, with David, my husband, lost in the digital ether of work emails on his phone, I was paralyzed. It was like the world outside the dining room had vanished, leaving only us, suspended in a charged, breathless silence neither of us dared to name. Dinner had always been a minefield in our uptown brownstone. David, a man of granite silences, more likely to bring boardroom battles to the table than actual conversation. Michael, his son from a first marriage, had moved back into our meticulously renovated townhouse a month prior, fresh out of college, carrying a quiet confidence that filled every room he entered, a presence that was impossible to ignore. I risked a glance at David that night, a silent plea for distraction, but he was miles away, battling some corporate inferno. My gaze drifted back to Michael, and for the first time I saw it. Something flicker in his eyes, a spark of curiosity, maybe even something bolder, something dangerous. It was unsettling. It was electrifying. The days leading up to that dinner had seemed innocuous enough, or so I'd convinced myself. I was adjusting to having Michael back in the house, slipping back into the polite, distant dance that had defined our relationship since I married David 2 years ago. Initially, I'd thought his return would barely ripple my carefully constructed life. Charming, respectful, our interactions barely scratched the surface. But then, subtly, almost imperceptibly, things shifted. It wasn't just me noticing him, it was him noticing me. The way his gaze lingered a beat too long when I walked into a room, the way he'd materialize in the kitchen when I was cooking, offering help with tasks that were already done, and now this. When dinner finally dissolved and the clatter of plates faded, I retreated to the kitchen, feigning a need to clean, desperate for a moment to breathe, to gather the fragments of myself. My heart hammered against my ribs, my hands trembled as I scrubbed at a pristine plate. I didn't hear him enter until his voice, low and calm, cut through the clatter. "Need a hand?" I spun around. He stood framed in the doorway, casual, but when I met his eyes, something there made my pulse leap. "No, I'm good," I managed, turning back to the sink, my voice tight. He didn't leave. Instead, he leaned against the counter, watching me with that unnervingly steady gaze of his. "You've been quiet tonight," he said after a beat. I forced a laugh, brittle and unconvincing. "Just tired, I guess." "Sure," he replied, his tone unreadable. I couldn't look at him, afraid of what I might see, or worse, what he might see in me. Even as I tried to focus on the mundane task of washing dishes, my body hummed with the echo of that illicit touch under the table. "Good night, Michael," I said finally, my voice firmer than I felt. "Good night, Sarah," he replied, his voice soft, almost knowing. I heard him leave, his footsteps receding down the hall, and I let out a shaky breath, gripping the edge of the sink as if it were a lifeline. It was nothing, I told myself, just a moment, a mistake. But deep down, a cold knot of certainty tightened in my stomach. I knew better. After that night, the air between Michael and me thickened. Subtly at first, like the hairline fracture in flawless glass, invisible unless you were actively searching. But I was searching, more than I wanted to admit. It wasn't just my perception, I felt it in him too. The lingering glances as we passed in the hallway, his casual questions about my day, his effortless smile that now carried an undercurrent, a hint of something more. I tried to tell myself I was imagining it, that I was reading too much into harmless interactions, but the problem wasn't him, it was me. One sweltering afternoon, I was in the kitchen, slicing lemons for iced tea, the city heat pressing in through the open window, when Michael wandered in, barefoot and shirtless, a towel draped over his shoulders, skin slick with sweat from what I assumed was a run in Central Park. I forced my focus onto the knife in my hand, the sharp citrus scent filling the air. "Hot out there," he said, reaching for a glass. "Looks like it," I replied, keeping my voice neutral, my eyes fixed on the cutting board. As he filled the glass with water, I couldn't help but glance up, just for a split second. He caught me. His eyes locked with mine over the rim of the glass, and for the first time the pretense dropped away. No polite stepmother-stepson charade to hide behind. "Something on your mind?" he asked, his voice low, teasing, but not unkind. I shook my head quickly, turning back to the cutting board, the knife suddenly clumsy in my hand. "Just making tea," I said, my voice too bright, too forced. He didn't push, but as he walked past me to leave the kitchen, his hand brushed lightly against the small of my back. It was such a fleeting touch, so innocuous on the surface, but it rooted me to the spot, the knife trembling in my hand. That evening, David was home, but barricaded in his home office as usual, barking orders into his headset. I was curled up on the plush velvet couch in the living room, a glass of crisp Sauvignon Blanc in hand, a novel open on my lap, though I hadn't turned a single page. Michael walked in, freshly showered, hair still damp, the clean, fresh scent of his cologne filling the air. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, gesturing to the opposite end of the couch. "Of course," I said, pretending to be engrossed in my book. He sat down, closer than I'd expected, the cushions dipping under his weight. For a long moment, we sat in silence, the murmur of the news on TV a thin veil over the charged stillness. I was hyper-aware of his presence, the warmth radiating from his body, the subtle, intoxicating scent of his cologne. "You seem different lately," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. I glanced up, startled. "Different how?" He shrugged, his gaze steady on mine, quieter, distracted. I laughed nervously, taking a sip of wine, the cool liquid doing little to soothe the sudden heat in my cheeks. Just adjusting, I guess. It's been a while since the house wasn't so empty. "Does it bother you?" he asked, leaning back against the couch, his gaze unwavering. "What? Having me here?" he clarified, his tone casual, but there was an edge to it, something I couldn't quite place. "I mean, I know I kind of dropped back into your life out of nowhere." "Of course not," I said quickly, too quickly. "It's nice, actually. The house feels alive again." He smiled at that, but it wasn't the easy, boyish smile I'd grown accustomed to. It was softer, almost intimate. "Good," he said, his voice low. I looked away, my heart hammering against my ribs. "I should head to bed," I said, standing too abruptly, nearly sloshing wine over the rim of my glass. Michael stood too, reaching out to steady me. His hand brushed mine, and the contact lingered, a spark igniting in the space between us. "Good night, Sarah," he said, his voice soft, almost a whisper. "Good night," I replied, barely able to meet his gaze. The days that followed were a blur of stolen glances and awkward silences. I tried to avoid him, to bury myself in work, but it was impossible. Not in this house, in this city where chance encounters were inevitable. And yet, despite my best efforts, I found myself drawn to him, a moth to a dangerous flame. One afternoon, I was in the meticulously manicured garden, pruning the rose bushes that David always neglected, the relentless summer sun beating down on my back. I just set down the shears when I heard footsteps behind me. "Need some help?" Michael's voice startled me. I turned to find him standing there shirtless again, a light sheen of sweat on his skin, the sunlight catching the muscles in his arms. "I think I've got it," I said, though my voice wavered, betraying my carefully constructed composure. He crouched beside me, plucking a stray weed from the rich soil. "You shouldn't be doing all this yourself," he said, his gaze fixed on the roses. "What's Dad even doing half the time?" I smiled faintly, focusing on the thorny stem. Working. Always working. He looked up at me, his gaze searching, intense. "Does that bother you?" I hesitated, unsure how to answer. "It's just how he is," I said finally, the words feeling hollow even to my own ears. "That's not what I asked," he said, his voice gentle but insistent. I opened my mouth to respond, to deflect, but the words caught in my throat. Before I could say anything, he reached out, his hand lightly brushing mine where it rested on the cool earth. "Michael," I said, my voice barely audible, a breath of protest. He didn't move, didn't pull away. "You don't have to say anything," he said, his voice low. I need you to know that I see you. I see how hard you try to hold everything together, how much you give and how little you get back. You deserve more than that, Sarah." His words hit me like a physical blow, the truth of them sinking deep into my chest, a painful, undeniable weight. For a moment, I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, and then, as if pulled by an invisible force, I leaned in. It wasn't much, just a slight shift, a small step closer, but it was enough. His hand slid over mine, his touch warm, steady, and in that moment I knew, with a terrifying clarity, that we had crossed a line, a point of no return. "I can't," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I meant it as a plea or a protest. "Yes, you can," he replied, his voice low and certain. We stayed like that, hands intertwined, for what felt like an eternity. the sounds of the city fading into a muted hum, the world around us dissolving into nothingness. And then, finally, I pulled away, my heart racing, a frantic bird trapped in my chest. "I have to go," I said, my voice trembling. I didn't look back as I hurried inside, fleeing the garden, but I could feel his eyes on me, could feel the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on me, a gathering storm. And deep down I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that this was far from over. Sleep was a distant country that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Michael, his face, the way his hand had felt in mine, the soft conviction in his voice when he said I deserved more. The logical part of my brain screamed that this had to stop, that I was teetering on the precipice of a catastrophic mistake. But there was another part, darker, quieter, that didn't want to stop. The next day, I became a ghost in my own home, avoiding him entirely. I left the apartment early, claiming errands I didn't need to run, and didn't return until long after dark. By the time I got back, the lights in Michael's room were off, the apartment silent. I let myself breathe, telling myself that the forced distance would let things settle, cool down, but it didn't. 3 days later, I found him in the library. It was late, David was out of town on a business trip, and the sprawling apartment felt cavernous, empty without him. I'd gone to pour myself a glass of wine, a desperate attempt to unwind, but as I passed the library, I saw the soft glow spilling from under the door. Michael was inside. He was sitting in one of the leather armchairs, a glass of amber whiskey in his hand, a book open on his lap, though I doubted he was reading. He looked up when I stepped inside, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "Couldn't sleep?" I asked, hesitating in the doorway, my voice a low murmur. "Something like that," he replied, his gaze steady. "What about you?" I held up my wine glass, a silent explanation. "Nightcap." He gestured to the chair across from him. "Join me?" I should have said no. Every fiber of my being screamed to retreat, to run. Instead, I walked in and sat down, clutching the wine glass like a shield. For a long moment, we sat in silence. The only sound the faint, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. "I've been thinking about what you said," I said finally, my voice breaking the stillness, the words hanging heavy in the air. He looked at me, his brow furrowing slightly. "What I said in the garden," he clarified. I nodded, my gaze fixed on the worn Persian rug beneath my feet. "About seeing me, about deserving more?" His expression softened, the hard edges melting away. "I meant it," he said, his voice low, sincere. "You shouldn't have said it," I whispered, the words barely audible. "Why not?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. "Because it's not your place," I said, finally looking up at him, meeting his gaze. "I'm your stepmother, Michael. Whatever this is, it can't happen." He leaned forward, setting his whiskey glass down on the mahogany table between us with a soft thud. "I don't see you as my stepmother, Sarah," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never have." His words hung in the air, undeniable, heavy with unspoken truth. I opened my mouth to respond, to argue, to deny, but no words came. Because deep down, buried beneath layers of denial and propriety, I knew he was right. Our relationship had never felt familial, not in the way it should have. "Tell me you don't feel it," he said, his voice barely a whisper, raw with vulnerability. "Tell me I'm imagining this." I couldn't. Instead, I stood abruptly, the wine glass nearly slipping from my trembling hand. "I need to go," I said, my voice shaking. But as I turned to leave, he reached out, his hand closing around my wrist, his touch firm but not forceful. When I looked back at him, his eyes were filled with something raw, unguarded, something that mirrored the chaos in my own heart. "Don't run from this," he said, his voice soft, pleading. "I'm not running," I lied, though my heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "Yes, you are," he said softly, his gaze unwavering. "You've been running since the moment this started." I stared at him, torn between every instinct screaming at me to flee, to escape, and the magnetic pull that kept me rooted in place, tethered to him by an invisible, unbreakable thread. And then, before I could stop myself, before logic or reason could intervene, I closed the distance between us. The first kiss was hesitant, almost timid, as if we were both afraid of what it meant, what it unleashed. But it deepened quickly, urgently, the weight of our suppressed desires, our unspoken emotions, breaking free all at once, a torrent of pent-up longing. When we finally pulled apart, breathless, trembling, I was adrift, lost in a sea of confusion and forbidden desire. "This is wrong," I whispered, though my voice lacked conviction, the words dissolving into the charged air between us. "Then why does it feel so right?" he asked, his gaze locked on mine, searching, questioning. I woke the next morning with a heavy weight in my chest, a mix of guilt and exhilaration. The memory of the night before, of the stolen kisses in the library, was vivid, undeniable. For a fleeting, blissful moment, I allowed myself to wonder if it had all been a dream, a figment of my overwrought imagination. But then, I stepped into the kitchen, and there he was, leaning against the granite countertop, a mug of coffee in his hand, sunlight streaming through the window, illuminating the faint stubble on his jaw, the lingering shadows under his eyes. He looked up as I entered, and the faintest smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Morning," he said casually, as if nothing had changed, as if the world hadn't tilted on its axis the night before. "Morning," I replied, my voice barely audible, a whisper of sound in the bright, silent kitchen. For a long, suspended moment, we stood there in silence, the unspoken tension between us thick, almost suffocating. Finally, he set his mug down on the counter and crossed the room, stopping just a foot away from me, the air crackling with unspoken words. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft, laced with concern. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if it was true, if I'd ever be okay again. "We shouldn't have done that," I said, my words barely above a whisper, a fragile plea for reason in the face of overwhelming emotion. "Maybe not," he said, his gaze steady, unwavering, locking with mine. "But I'm not sorry." I looked away, unable to meet his eyes, the weight of his words settling heavily in my stomach. "This can't happen again, Michael," I said, the words a desperate attempt to regain control, to rebuild the crumbling walls around my carefully constructed life. He didn't respond immediately, the silence stretching between us, taut and electric. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but firm, laced with an undeniable certainty that chilled me to the bone. "I think we both know that's not true, Sarah." His words sent a shiver through me, a cold premonition of what was to come. And deep down, despite all my protests, all my carefully constructed defenses, I knew he was right. Over the next week, we tried to maintain the charade, to pretend that nothing had shifted between us, that the line hadn't been crossed. But the facade was fragile, paper-thin, and it crumbled quickly, inevitably. The stolen glances became bolder, more frequent, impossible to ignore. A brush of his hand against mine as we passed in the hallway, a whispered exchange in the kitchen when David was locked away in his office, oblivious to the storm brewing under his own roof. One evening, while David was out at a late business dinner, Michael and I found ourselves alone in the sprawling living room, the city lights twinkling outside the panoramic windows like distant stars. The tension between us was unbearable, a physical ache, a silent scream, and when he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine, a feather-light touch that ignited a wildfire within me I didn't pull away. The secrecy of it all, the danger, the forbidden nature of our connection only heightened the intensity, the intoxicating thrill of it all. We met in hidden corners of the apartment, in the shadows of the garden after dark, even in the secluded guest house at the edge of the property, a small oasis of privacy in the heart of the city. Each stolen moment felt like a victory, a defiant act against the inevitable looming threat of discovery. But the weight of what we were doing, the constant fear of exposure, grew heavier with each passing day, a suffocating burden. The fragile bubble we'd built, the illusion of secrecy and control, shattered completely when David announced that Eleanor, an old family friend, a woman with eyes like steel and a mind like a razor, would be staying with us for a few days. Eleanor was sharp, perceptive, always seemed to know more than she let on. From the moment she arrived, stepping into our meticulously curated world with a knowing smile, I could feel her eyes on me, watching, analyzing, dissecting every interaction. She was too clever, too observant, and I knew, with a sickening certainty, that it was only a matter of time before she'd piece things together, before the carefully constructed walls around my secret life would come crashing down. And then there was the night she cornered me in the kitchen, her expression unreadable, her voice deceptively light. "You seem different, Sarah," she said, her tone casual, almost conversational, but her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. "I'm fine," I replied, forcing a smile, my hands trembling as I reached for a glass of water, needing something, anything to steady myself. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, her eyes glinting with an unsettling knowingness. "I wonder if David knows." My blood ran cold, the casual lightness of her tone suddenly chilling, predatory. "Knows what?" I managed, my voice a strained whisper. Her smile was slow, calculated, a predator's smile. "You tell me." The days after Eleanor's cryptic comment were excruciating, a slow, agonizing burn of paranoia. I couldn't decipher her intentions, couldn't tell if she genuinely suspected something, if she'd seen or heard something, or if she was simply toying with me, enjoying the game of cat and mouse. But her presence in the apartment, her constant watchful gaze, made every moment feel like walking a tightrope stretched across a chasm of fear and uncertainty. She hovered during meals, her conversation deceptively innocuous, peppering Michael and me with innocent-sounding questions that felt loaded with hidden meaning, each word a veiled accusation. I tried to act normal, to maintain the facade of normalcy, but the strain of hiding what was happening between Michael and me, the constant performance, was taking its toll. The stolen moments, the secret rendezvous that had once felt thrilling, now carried the heavy weight of paranoia, of impending exposure, and I started to wonder, with a growing sense of dread, how long we could keep this up, how long before everything came crashing down, burying us all in the wreckage. One evening, I was sitting in the living room, the panoramic city view a blur through the tears that welled in my eyes, trying to lose myself in a book. Any escape from the suffocating reality of my situation, when my phone buzzed on the coffee table, a jarring intrusion into my misery. I glanced at the screen, expecting a text from David, a curt demand, or a dismissive remark, or perhaps a message from one of my friends, a meaningless distraction. But the message that flashed across the screen made my blood turn to ice. "I know what you're doing." There was no name, no number, just a blank sender, a faceless threat lurking in the digital shadows. I stared at the screen, my heart hammering against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of panic. It had to be a mistake, a wrong number, a cruel joke. But then another message came through moments after the first, solidifying my fear, confirming my worst nightmares. "Meet me tomorrow at 4 p.m., the coffee shop on Bleecker Street. Don't make me come to David." I locked the phone, my fingers numb, and pressed it against my chest, struggling to breathe, the air suddenly thin, suffocating. Who could it be? Eleanor? No, she was far too smug, too confident to hide behind anonymous threats. Someone else had seen something, someone else knew, someone who now held my entire life in their hands, poised to shatter it with a single word. The next morning, I found Michael in the guest house. The secluded sanctuary where he'd been spending most of his time since Eleanor's arrival, a self-imposed exile from the main apartment. He was seated at the small desk, flipping through a stack of papers, sunlight filtering through the window, illuminating the tense set of his shoulders. He looked up the moment I entered, the door clicking softly shut behind me. "Hey," he said, his tone warm, a brief respite from the cold fear that had gripped me. But his smile faded as soon as he saw my face, the strained lines around my eyes, the pallor beneath my makeup. "What's wrong?" I hesitated, my throat tight with unshed tears, the words catching, refusing to surface. I closed the door behind me, the sound echoing in the small space, sealing us in. "We have a problem," I said finally, my voice barely a whisper, the weight of the situation finally breaking through my carefully constructed defenses. "What kind of problem?" he asked, his eyes narrowing, his gaze sharpening with concern. I handed him my phone, the screen still illuminated, the threatening messages stark against the white background. He read them quickly, his jaw tightening, a muscle twitching in his cheek. "Who the hell sent this?" he asked, his voice low, dangerous. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice trembling, the fear coiling tighter in my stomach. "But whoever it is, they know. They're threatening to tell David." Michael stood, abruptly, pushing back from the desk, pacing the small space like a caged animal, his energy restless, volatile. "It could be Eleanor," he said finally, his voice tight with anger. "She's been watching us like a hawk." "I thought that too," I said, echoing his suspicion, the possibility chilling me to the bone. "But this doesn't feel like her. She's the type to confront me directly, not hide behind anonymous messages, playing games." "Then who?" he asked again, the question hanging in the air between us, unanswered, terrifying. "I don't know," I said again, my voice breaking, the fear finally overwhelming me. Michael stepped closer, his movements gentle now, his anger replaced by a fierce protectiveness. He placed his hands on my shoulders, his touch warm, grounding, a brief anchor in the storm raging within me. "Hey," he said, his voice low and reassuring. "We'll figure this out, Sarah. I promise. I won't let anything happen to you." His words were meant to be comforting, a promise of protection, but they did little to quell the fear bubbling inside me, the icy dread that threatened to consume me whole. At 4:12 p.m. sharp, my heart pounding a frantic tattoo against my ribs, I walked into the small, unassuming coffee shop on Bleecker Street, the designated meeting place, the epicenter of my impending doom. It was a quiet place, tucked away from the bustling street, with only a handful of customers scattered across the mismatched tables, the air thick with the aroma of roasted coffee beans and nervous anticipation. I scanned the room, my eyes darting from face to face, searching for someone, anyone who might be the sender of the messages, the architect of my impending downfall. I didn't have to wait long. A man in his late 50s, his face vaguely familiar, stood from a table in the corner near the back, waving me over with a chillingly familiar gesture. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, recognition hitting me like a physical blow. "Richard?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper, the name tasting like ash in my mouth. Richard Hadley, David's former business partner. The two of them had founded their company together, built it from the ground up, over 20 years ago, but their partnership had ended in a bitter, acrimonious falling out, a messy legal battle that had left deep scars on both sides. David had always spoken of Richard with disdain, with contempt, calling him a liar, a cheat, a thief. And now, here he was, the ghost of David's past resurrected to haunt me in the present. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended, a desperate attempt to mask the fear that threatened to overwhelm me. I slid into the seat across from him, the wooden chair scraping against the worn floorboards, the sound amplified in the hushed coffee shop. He smiled, a thin, predatory smile that didn't reach his eyes, didn't soften the hard lines of his face. "It's good to see you too, Catherine," he said smoothly, the use of my full name sending a fresh wave of unease through me. "Cut the pleasantries, Richard," I snapped, my voice trembling despite my efforts to project an air of defiance. "You sent the messages, didn't you?" "Guilty," he admitted, leaning back in his chair, his gaze unwavering, assessing. "What do you want?" I repeated, my voice laced with impatience, with a desperate need to understand the terms of this terrifying game. Richard's smile widened, a chilling display of predatory satisfaction. "I want your help," he said simply, the words hanging in the air defying comprehension. "Help? Help with what?" I asked, my voice incredulous, the absurdity of his demand almost comical, if it weren't so terrifying. "With ruining David," he replied, his tone casual, almost conversational, as if he were asking me to pass the sugar, to comment on the weather, not to participate in the destruction of my own life, of my husband's empire. I stared at him, stunned, speechless, the reality of his words sinking in, cold and heavy. "You're out of your mind," I managed finally, the words a weak protest, a futile attempt to deny the impossible situation. "Maybe," he said, shrugging, unfazed by my reaction, by my disbelief. "But that doesn't change the fact that I have something you don't want getting out, Sarah." "You don't have any proof," I said, my voice wavering, betraying the uncertainty that gnawed at me, the fear that he held more cards than I knew. "Don't I?" He countered, his smile widening, a triumphant glint in his eyes. He pulled his phone from his pocket, a sleek black rectangle of digital menace. He tapped the screen a few times, his movements deliberate, almost theatrical, before sliding it across the table towards me, the polished surface cool against my trembling fingertips. My stomach dropped, plummeted into an abyss of icky dread, as I saw the image displayed on the screen. A blurry, grainy photo, but unmistakable, undeniable. Michael and me in the garden, bathed in the golden light of late afternoon, his hand brushing my cheek, my gaze locked on his as we leaned towards each other. The unspoken desire, the forbidden connection, captured in a single damning frame. "How did you—" I trailed off, my voice failing me, the question hanging in the air, unanswered, irrelevant in the face of the devastating reality. "I have my ways," he said, his voice smooth, smug, slipping the phone back into his pocket, reclaiming his power, his control. "Now here's the deal, Sarah. You help me sabotage David's latest deal with Roswell Ventures, and this picture and a few others I have never see the light of day. Refuse and, well, I think we both know where this ends." I returned home that evening feeling like a trapped animal, cornered, desperate, with no escape in sight. I couldn't tell David, not without unleashing a cataclysmic explosion, not without destroying everything we had built, everything I had tried to salvage. And I couldn't give in to Richard's demands, couldn't betray David in such a profound, unforgivable way, couldn't become a pawn in Richard's twisted game of revenge. When I told Michael what had happened, what Richard wanted, what he threatened, he was furious, his anger a raw, volatile force that filled the small guest house. "We can't let him get away with this," he said, pacing the room like a caged lion, his movements agitated, restless. "What choice do we have?" I asked, my voice breaking, the weight of the situation crushing me, suffocating me. He stopped pacing, turning to me, his eyes blazing with a fierce determination, a desperate resolve. "I'll take the fall," he said, the words ringing in the small space, heavy with sacrifice, with a reckless kind of love. "No," I said immediately, vehemently, the word ripped from my throat, a desperate denial. "I won't let you do that, Michael." "What other option is there, Sarah?" he demanded, his voice rising, laced with frustration, with a desperate plea for reason. "If this gets out, it'll destroy your life, your marriage, everything." "And what about you?" I countered, my voice trembling, tears welling in my eyes. "You think this won't ruin you too? You think David will just forgive and forget? This will destroy you too, Michael." He didn't have an answer, couldn't deny the devastating truth of my words. The silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken fear, with the crushing weight of our impossible situation. That night, Eleanor cornered me again, this time in the hallway outside my bedroom, her timing impeccable, her presence always unsettling, always laced with a subtle threat. "You look stressed, Sarah," she said, her voice laced with false concern, her eyes sharp, probing. "It's been a long day, Eleanor," I replied, trying to brush past her, to escape her watchful gaze, her unsettling proximity. She stepped in front of me, blocking my path, her smile tight, predatory. "You know, Sarah," she said, her tone dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, her eyes glinting with a knowing malice. "Secrets have a way of coming out, no matter how well you think you're hiding them." I stared at her, my heart pounding, a frantic drumbeat of fear and suspicion. "What are you talking about, Eleanor?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, the question a desperate plea for clarity, for understanding. She smiled, a slow, predatory smile that sent a chill down my spine. "You tell me, Sarah." For the first time, a flicker of doubt sparked in my mind. Maybe she was bluffing. Maybe she didn't know anything concrete. Maybe she was just fishing, testing the waters, preying on my fear. But whether she knew the truth or not, whether her suspicions were grounded in fact or merely intuition, one thing was terrifyingly clear. My carefully constructed world, my meticulously curated life, was teetering on the verge of collapse, about to shatter into a million irreparable pieces. The breaking point came during one of David's lavish dinner parties, a carefully orchestrated display of wealth and social standing, a performance of perfect domesticity. His obsession with appearances was on full display. The perfectly manicured terrace overlooking Central Park, the endless flow of vintage champagne, the carefully curated guest list of business associates and socialites all assembled to witness the spectacle of David's success. Eleanor, of course, was there, gliding through the room like a sleek, silent predator, her eyes constantly scanning, watching, waiting to pounce. Michael and I avoided each other all night, meticulously maintaining a polite distance, barely exchanging a glance, the forced indifference a painful charade. But the tension between us was palpable, a live wire humming beneath the surface of forced smiles and strained pleasantries. Richard, however, was conspicuously absent, a ghost in the room, his absence more unsettling than his presence would have been. I had no idea if he was planning to expose me tonight, to detonate the bomb he held in his hands in front of David's carefully assembled audience, or if he was merely letting me stew in my own anxiety, savoring my fear from afar. Either way, I couldn't shake the feeling that the ground beneath me was about to crumble, that the carefully constructed facade of my life was about to shatter, irrevocably. Dinner was served outside, on the expansive terrace, the long table glittering with candlelight, crystal glasses, and polished silverware, a scene of opulent perfection. I sat beside David, who was regaling the guests with a self-congratulatory anecdote about his latest business deal, his voice booming with self-importance, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface of his perfect world. Michael was seated 2 spots down, his expression unreadable, his gaze fixed on his plate. A study in forced indifference. I tried to focus on my food, the perfectly prepared lobster risotto, but my appetite had vanished, replaced by a knot of anxiety that tightened with each passing moment. Halfway through the meal, Eleanor leaned forward, her voice cutting through the polite murmur of conversation like a blade, her gaze fixed on David. "David, you're so lucky to have Sarah," she said, her tone saccharine sweet, but the words laced with a subtle, venomous undertone. "She's been holding everything together, so flawlessly, while you're off saving the world, building your empire." David chuckled, completely missing the subtle venom in her words, the barely veiled accusation. "That's what makes her perfect," he said, raising his glass in a mock toast, his gaze sweeping over me, possessive, unseeing. Eleanor's smile widened, a predatory display of teeth, but her gaze shifted, locking with mine, a silent challenge, a knowing accusation. "She's certainly been busy," she said, her voice deceptively light, almost playful, but the words hung in the air, heavy with implication, with unspoken knowledge. My chest tightened, my breath catching in my throat. I froze, my hand gripping the edge of the tablecloth, knuckles white, nails digging into the linen. Michael's fork clinked against his plate as he set it down, the sound sharp, jarring in the sudden stillness. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowed, his gaze fixed on Eleanor, his body tense, coiled. "Is there a point to this, Eleanor?" he asked, his tone sharp, clipped, the forced politeness dissolving, revealing the raw anger beneath. "Oh, no point at all, darling," she replied innocently, her eyes wide, feigning surprise. "Just making conversation." But the smirk she shot me, a fleeting, triumphant flash of malice, told me everything. She knew. She had been watching, waiting, and now she was ready to play her hand, to expose everything, to revel in the chaos. After dinner, I excused myself to the kitchen, desperate for a moment to breathe, to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the terrace, the suffocating presence of Eleanor's knowing gaze. My hands were shaking uncontrollably as I gripped the cool marble countertop, trying to steady myself, to regain some semblance of composure. But before I could calm the frantic beating of my heart, before I could even draw a full breath, David walked in, his expression dark, thunderous, his eyes like chips of ice. "Catherine," he said, his voice low, cold, dangerously calm, the quiet fury far more terrifying than any raised voice could have been. I turned, my heart sinking, plummeting into an abyss of despair. "David," I whispered, my voice barely audible, the name a plea, a protest, a futile attempt at denial. "What is it?" He held up his phone, his hand trembling slightly, a rare display of uncontrolled emotion, and the sight of the screen made my stomach drop, bile rising in my throat, choking me. It was the photo, Richard's photo, the one of Michael and me in the garden, the damning evidence of my betrayal, of our forbidden desire. "Care to explain this, Catherine?" David asked, his voice deceptively calm, the words laced with a chilling undercurrent of rage. I opened my mouth, but no words came, my mind a blank canvas of panic. My thoughts raced, frantic, desperate, searching for an explanation, for a plausible lie, for anything that could undo what he had seen, anything that could erase the undeniable truth staring back at him from the screen. But there was nothing. No words could bridge this chasm, no lie could mend this broken trust. "Who sent this to you?" I asked finally, my voice barely above a whisper, a desperate attempt to deflect, to delay the inevitable confrontation. "Richard," David said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Richard Hadley, he emailed it to me this morning, along with a lot of other interesting accusations." I swallowed hard, the weight of the situation crashing down on me, crushing me beneath its immense force. "It's not what it looks like," I said weakly, the words a pathetic, transparent lie, even to my own ears. We both knew it was exactly what it looked like. "What is it then, Catherine?" he demanded, his voice rising, the carefully controlled calm finally cracking, giving way to a raw, visceral anger. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like my wife and my son have been sneaking around behind my back, betraying me, humiliating me." Before I could respond, before I could even formulate a coherent lie, Michael appeared in the doorway, drawn by the rising tension, by the unspoken storm raging in the kitchen. His eyes flicked between David and me, taking in the scene, the charged atmosphere, the damning photo on David's phone, and he immediately understood. "This is my fault," he said, stepping forward, his voice clear, steady, a stark contrast to the chaos swirling around us. David turned on him, his face a mask of rage, his eyes blazing with fury. "You're damn right it's your fault, Michael," he spat, his voice dripping with contempt. "You come back here, back into my house, and this is how you repay me? This is how you thank me?" "I didn't mean for it to happen," Michael said, his voice remaining steady despite the palpable tension in the room, despite the fury directed at him. "But don't blame Catherine, Dad. This was all me. She didn't want this." "Don't you dare try to protect her, Michael," David snapped, his voice rising to a roar. "She's just as guilty as you are. She's your stepmother, for God's sake." "Stop!" I said finally, finding my voice, the word a desperate cry for reason in the escalating chaos. "Stop it! Both of you, this isn't helping. None of this is helping." "Helping?" David laughed, a bitter, humorless sound. You think there's anything that can fix this, Catherine? You think there's any way to undo this betrayal, this disgusting mess? Before the argument could escalate further, before David's rage could explode into something truly destructive, my phone buzzed in my pocket, a jarring interruption in the unfolding drama. I pulled it out, my fingers numb, and saw another message flash across the screen, from Richard. "How's David taking the news, Sarah?" The realization hit me like a freight train, a sudden, sickening wave of clarity. Richard hadn't sent the photo to David out of some twisted sense of justice, out of some moral outrage. This wasn't about exposing our affair, not really. This was all part of his plan, his meticulously orchestrated scheme to destroy David, to dismantle his empire, to exact his long-awaited revenge. "David, listen to me," I said, stepping closer to him, my voice urgent, desperate. "Richard set this up. He's been blackmailing me for weeks, threatening to expose us unless I helped him sabotage your business deal with Roswell Ventures." David frowned, his anger momentarily giving way to confusion, his brow furrowing as he tried to process the sudden shift in the narrative. "What are you talking about, Catherine?" he asked, his voice laced with disbelief. "He's using this," I said, holding up my phone, the damning photo still illuminated on the screen. "He's using us, our affair, to manipulate me, to control me. He wants to ruin you, David, and he's using us to do it." For a long moment, David said nothing, his gaze flicking between me and Michael, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. Anger, confusion, disbelief, and perhaps, just perhaps, a flicker of understanding. Finally, he sighed, a long, weary exhalation, running a hand through his hair, his anger momentarily deflating, replaced by a profound sense of exhaustion. "I can't deal with this right now," he muttered, turning abruptly and walking out of the kitchen, leaving Michael and me standing in the wreckage of our shattered lives, the weight of what had just happened, what was still to come, pressing down on us, suffocating us. "This is over," I said finally, my voice trembling, the words a quiet pronouncement of defeat, of resignation. He looked at me, his expression pained, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and a lingering, forbidden longing. "Catherine," he started, reaching for me, his hand outstretched, hesitant. "No, Michael," I said firmly, cutting him off, stepping back, putting distance between us, a physical manifestation of the chasm that had opened up between us, between our lives. "It's done. We've caused enough damage, more than enough." He didn't argue, didn't protest. He just stood there, his gaze locked on mine, his eyes filled with a silent grief, a profound sense of loss. But the look in his eyes, the unspoken understanding that passed between us, said everything. There was nothing left to say. David filed for divorce the next day. He didn't say much, his silence more damning than any accusation, his cold demeanor making it clear that he wanted nothing more to do with me, that I had become an unwelcome ghost in his meticulously ordered life. Michael moved out shortly after, disappearing from my life without so much as a goodbye, leaving only silence and the echoes of what could have been. As for Richard, his elaborate plan to sabotage David's business deal, to exact his revenge, backfired spectacularly. David, fueled by a righteous anger, by a desire to reclaim control, reported Richard to the authorities for blackmail, for extortion, for attempting to manipulate and destroy him. The last I heard, Richard Hadley was under investigation for fraud, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him, mirroring the destruction he had tried to inflict on David, on me, on us all.